Caroline Jenkins, the relentless HOA Karen, took her obsession with rules too far, targeting Tom's driveway for being too long and ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic. Her constant complaints and attacks only fueled the fire, but what she never expected was that Tom, a former military man, had a plan in mind. In a shocking twist, military engineers arrived to extend the driveway right into her living room. But listen closely, because when the dust settled, justice had a way of delivering its own sweet, silent revenge. Caroline Jenkins was the very definition of an HOA Karen. You know the type. The neighbor who thinks they have the right to dictate every detail of everyone else's life. From overgrown lawns to improper mailbox placements, Caroline's list of complaints was endless. But this time, she'd gone too far. Tom and Emily, the young couple who lived next door, were good, quiet people. They loved their little home on the outskirts of the neighborhood. Their driveway, a simple path leading up to their two-car garage, had always been a non-issue. It was nothing fancy, just practical. Enough room to park and move around. Nothing that would ever catch anyone's attention. Until Caroline decided it was too long. That's right. Caroline Jenkins, with her ever-watchful eye, had determined that Tom's driveway was too long. She claimed it stretched too far into the street, disrupting the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. And apparently, in Caroline's mind, a driveway's length could make or break the suburban dream. It was a minor detail, sure, but to her, it was an affront. A blemish on the pristine image of her perfect little world. She didn't stop there. Caroline took her complaint straight to the HOA, and not just once. Oh no, she bombarded them with letter after letter, phone call after phone call, all demanding that Tom's driveway be shortened, claiming it was an eyesore. She called it a blight, a threat to property values, and as if that wasn't enough, insisted it violated the unspoken rules of the neighborhood, all over a driveway. The absurdity of it all started to spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, exchanging looks and wondering how someone could be so nitpicky over something so trivial. But for Caroline, it wasn't trivial. It was the principle of the matter. In her eyes, this was just another instance of someone else's lack of respect for the neighborhood's values. And in her perfect little world, respect meant conformity. Soon, tension began to build. Tom and Emily had always gotten along with everyone, but now there was an undercurrent of unease. They had never imagined something as simple as their driveway would stir up such drama. What started as an annoying complaint from one overly critical neighbor had escalated into a neighborhood-wide issue, and it was only a matter of time before it reached its breaking point. Tom stared at his driveway one evening, the very object of Caroline's scorn. It looked the same as it had for years. Too long, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Caroline was about to learn just how far she was willing to push before she'd regret it. At first, Tom and Emily tried to brush it off. Caroline's complaints were ridiculous, and they figured if they ignored her, she'd eventually get bored and move on to her next obsession. But that was a mistake. Caroline wasn't the type to back down. Not now. Not ever. Her complaints became louder, more demanding. What started as a letter or two to the HOA turned into daily phone calls, constant emails, and even passive-aggressive notes slipped under their door. She wasn't content with just the driveway anymore. She began pointing out everything. The fence was too high. The garden was too wild. Even the color of their front door wasn't neutral enough to fit her vision of suburban perfection. The couple's once peaceful evenings were now consumed by Caroline's absurd demands. They could no longer enjoy a quiet dinner without hearing her voice echoing through the walls, complaining about something else. Caroline had turned into a constant shadow over their lives, her grip tightening with every passing day. At first, Emily tried to stay calm. "She's just one person," she'd say, trying to soothe Tom. "We can handle this." But Tom was getting fed up. His patience, usually unshakable, was wearing thin. He had served in the military, fought in places where true chaos reigned, and yet here he was struggling to deal with a woman over a driveway. This wasn't just about the driveway anymore. This was about the principle of the thing. Caroline had crossed a line, and Tom couldn't ignore it any longer. Emily could see it in his eyes. A simmering frustration that was just about to boil over. Tom wasn't the kind of guy who liked to get involved in drama, but something about the way Caroline relentlessly pushed, always demanding more, always finding something new to criticize, it got under his skin. He had spent years in the military, following orders, keeping his head down, making do with what was handed to him. But he was tired of this, tired of being pushed around by someone who didn't even know how to mind her own business. One evening, unable to shake the frustration building up inside him, Tom picked up the phone and called his old friend Adam, an Army engineer he'd served with. Adam was a big guy, a no-nonsense kind of person with a knack for finding solutions to problems, no matter how unconventional. "Hey, Tom," Adam said when he answered. "What's going on?" Tom filled him in on Caroline's constant harassment, detailing the absurdity of it all. When he was done, Adam was silent for a beat. Then Adam's voice broke through, a grin obvious even in his tone. "You know what? If she thinks the driveway's too long, let's just make it longer." Into her living room. Tom stared at the phone for a moment, then let out a laugh, something he hadn't done in days. Adam's suggestion, though outrageous, felt like exactly what he needed to hear. It was brilliant, in its own ridiculous way. Caroline had crossed every line imaginable, and now it was time for the tables to turn. But Tom's laughter quickly faded as the reality of it set in. They were about to take things to a whole new level. As the conversation ended, Tom stared out the window, watching the neighborhood as if seeing it for the first time. Caroline had made this personal, and now he was ready to fight back. The anger inside him simmered, and with a slow smile, he realized something. He wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to let her destroy his peace. This was about to get very interesting. The next morning, Caroline Jenkins woke up early, as usual, to inspect her meticulously groomed yard. She sipped her coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air, blissfully unaware of the chaos that was about to unfold. But when she glanced out the window, her calm morning took a sharp turn. A convoy of military trucks and engineers were pulling up in front of Tom's house. Their trucks hummed with the powerful engines, the kind of machines that seemed capable of moving mountains. Caroline squinted, confused. What in the world? At first, she thought maybe there was some sort of repair going on, but then she saw the unmistakable figures of engineers unloading heavy equipment. This wasn't just some quick fix. They weren't there to maintain the driveway. They were there to expand it. Caroline's mind raced. What were they doing? The heavy machinery roared to life, and she watched, stunned, as they began to work. At first, the engineers moved the earth gently, but soon they began tearing into the ground with precision and purpose. It became clear. Tom wasn't just fixing his driveway. He was extending it right into her front yard. She could hardly believe it. Her eyes widened and her hand trembled as she set her coffee cup down. For a moment, she stood frozen, not knowing how to react. But then the rage began to build, slowly at first, like a storm rolling in from the horizon. Caroline rushed out of her house in a flurry of motion, her high heels clicking angrily on the pavement as she stormed across her yard. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted, her voice cracking with indignation. Her face was red with fury. She was barely holding herself together. The engineers didn't even flinch. They continued their work, ignoring her as if she were just another passing inconvenience. They were professionals, doing their job, and Caroline's outburst didn't slow them down. One of them glanced over, giving her a brief, polite nod, before going back to his task. She was almost shaking with fury now. "You can't just do this," she yelled, her voice high-pitched with a mix of disbelief and anger. "This is my property. You can't just take my land." But no matter how much she shouted, no matter how many times she tried to wave them off or demand answers, the engineers continued their work. Unfazed, a bulldozer rumbled as it scraped away the earth, and soon a brand new section of driveway began to stretch toward her property line. The concrete mixers followed, the smell of fresh cement filling the air. The drive was growing, and with every inch, Caroline felt her grip on control slipping. As if that wasn't enough, she saw Tom and Emily standing in their front yard, watching the whole spectacle unfold. Their faces were calm, but there was a look of smug satisfaction in their eyes. They weren't angry or scared. They weren't worried at all. They were enjoying it. Tom caught Caroline's gaze, and for a brief second their eyes locked. His expression was almost too casual, too calm, as if this was exactly what he had planned. Emily stood beside him, arms crossed, but there was a quiet smirk on her face, too. Caroline's blood boiled. How dare they? Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she marched up to Tom's front yard, practically shaking with fury. She opened her mouth to shout, to demand that they stop this madness, but as she did, she saw the look on Tom's face. He wasn't going to budge. This wasn't just a driveway anymore. This was a statement, and he was making it loud and clear. The driveway now stretched right up to her windows, its smooth concrete leading directly toward her house. It was absurd. It was in your face. And Caroline realized with a jolt of anger that rattled her to her core that she had lost control of this situation. It wasn't just her neighborhood anymore. It was Tom's now. Her rage surged again. She tried to call the HOA, but the number seemed distant, unreachable. She tried to get in touch with anyone who would listen, but she was alone, standing there, helpless, as the driveway grew longer, the machines droning on in a relentless chorus. It wasn't just a driveway now. It was a symbol of everything she hated. Tom and Emily had pushed back, and they had pushed hard. This was payback, and it was working. Caroline stood at the edge of her front lawn, her eyes locked on the new driveway that now stretched boldly across her property. The massive stretch of concrete seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of everything she had tried and failed to accomplish. It wasn't just a driveway anymore. It was a symbol of her defeat, and every inch of it felt like a personal slap in the face. She had spent weeks sending letters, making phone calls, all in an attempt to force Tom and Emily to shorten their driveway. She had argued that it was too long, that it disrupted the neighborhood's aesthetic, that it went against the HOA's rules. Every time she walked out her door, she looked at their driveway with disgust, believing that somehow, if she pushed hard enough, she could get them to fix it. But now, as she stood there, looking at the result of her crusade, she could only feel a deep, gnawing sense of failure. The engineers were still finishing their work, wrapping up the last bits of cement and smoothing out the edges. But the damage was already done. The driveway wasn't just a little longer now. It was a monumental stretch of concrete that seemed to mock the very principles Caroline had worked so hard to uphold. And the worst part? It wasn't even finished yet. The driveway now led straight toward her property line, its smooth surface extending with the kind of defiance she had never expected. The work wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a bold statement, one that Tom and Emily had made, and one that she could do nothing about. Inside her house, Tom and Emily watched the whole spectacle unfold through their window, sipping their morning coffee. There were no angry shouts, no rushed movements. They didn't even seem to care that Caroline was standing there, fuming in disbelief. Instead, they took it all in with calm satisfaction, as if everything was going exactly as planned. Tom leaned back in his chair, his mug in hand. "Guess she won't be complaining about that anymore," he said, his voice light, almost amused. Emily didn't even need to say anything. She just nodded, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. They both knew it was over. Caroline had pushed too far. She had thought that by following the rules, by enforcing the HOA's petty regulations, she would somehow win. But in reality, all she had done was provoke a response that she wasn't prepared for. Now, she was the one left staring at the absurdity of her actions, and all she could do was watch as her so-called perfect world of HOA rules crumbled before her eyes. For Tom and Emily, it was sweet, silent victory. The tension, the complaints, the angry letters, all of it had been worth it, not just to defend their property, but to prove a point. They had made their stand, and they had done it in a way that Caroline could never have anticipated. There was no long, drawn-out battle, no legal war, just a quiet, deliberate act of defiance, followed by a very real, very permanent reminder of who had come out on top. For Caroline, there was nothing left to do but stare. The driveway wasn't just a concrete path. It was the final nail in the coffin of her carefully curated world. The rules, the complaints, the control, it had all fallen apart. And there was something about the utter finality of it all that made it satisfying. A feeling of release washed over Tom and Emily as they watched Caroline through their window, standing frozen, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. For all her rules and complaints, she had become the target of her own relentless pursuit of perfection. In the end, it wasn't just the driveway that had been extended. It was her own sense of control, stretched to the breaking point, and finally snapped back into place with a satisfying, resounding thud.